Oh, look at that beautiful Philip Shinn. How you doing, Philip Shinn?
Darling, dear, debonair Daniel.
Oh,
I'm
goodness.
doing wonderful. How are you today?
I'm fine. I appreciate you coming out at this different time. It's very nice to see you, my beloved friend. I hope you're well. What you been thinking about? Where you brain been
Oh,
these
it's
days?
fantastic. I'm writing a piece for Cadell's Eclit class. Hey, Michelle. Um, called Confessions of a Dangerous Horse Boy, where I look to explore how relationships can move from the tragic and dramatic to the comedic.
Mm.
And right now, I'm looking at playing around with the idea that in molecular biology, we know that every 7 to 10 years, your cells are like completely new. But cognitive science shows us that pretty much the neurons you're born with are the ones you die with.
Mm.
So when you're dating someone, you're kind of dating their neurons too. And not to forget that it's sort of like an evolving thing as far as how they make connections and how time is either very nice or just a little nice or not so nice because there's a lot of the things that happen as you age, that can make it difficult for people to remember certain things and
Mm.
just how that moves in a relationship. And I've got something called the Christmas flag because there's like, yeah, I'm just trying to show that we color the flag. So some people are like, this is definitely a red flag, and people are like, this is definitely a green flag. Just to say that those are like pretty much tastes. Um, and underneath that, I'm looking at what I call a gold and a black flag because on some level, being is like so incredibly golden as to be incomprehensible. Just like smack you with its light. Um, but there is also that darkness that's kind of certain things to just give you more options and more things to look at when it seems like you're stuck in the linguistic associations you have with the uh with your partner, like just through all the habits that you have gone through. And like I'm sure this never happens, but it's like the black kind of kind of being like forgetting, like maybe say one day the chicken is a little dry and Daniel's like, I thought you loved me, Michelle. What's with and you're feeding our kids this, like, really? And then she maybe
Too
um
soon. Too soon, Philip.
well, maybe she passes you the ketchup or the marinara sauce, but also like just to remind ourselves, like, oh, hey, you forgot, like, yes, it is about good chicken, but it's not all about the chicken.
Oh, yeah.
So that's kind of it's been a lot of fun doing that, and also just kind of observing the realness of different relationships and
Oh,
and
yeah.
how they evolve
Mm.
and how that's beautiful.
Delightful. I love that. And Michael, it's wonderful to see you here. So I enjoyed our conversation earlier this week, and it's been, as I was saying, wonderful to have you in the Parallax course. And Philip Michael is awesome. He always has fire to bring. And I love what you were saying. It's very interesting. Michelle was also in the kitchen mentioning this question of platonic forms in relationships and the importance of thinking on like different principles on like what is a good husband because or a good wife or what's the right thing to do. And it's very interesting because if neurons are relatively constant, and yet perhaps our use of the neurons with times can kind of go away, are we, is there something about thinking and love that strongly go together, right? Also, if we're changing through time, what exactly is it that we love? Like when we say I do, and love someone, we're committing ourselves to a process that we can't know ahead of time until it occurs. So does that invalidate the I do, or does it mean the I do is to something that we may not realize what it is? It's the come what may. Maybe it's more of a come what may. I that is the sickness and in health kind of thing. But it is interesting because it suggests as well, like you were saying on the sometimes it's not about the cat, the chicken, is about something else. Right there, there's a kind of thinking, a kind of awareness, as Simone Weil, or attention that is required to know that when you're talking about the chicken, you're not actually talking about the chicken. And I may put Michelle on the spot to talk a little bit about the Platonic forms and different things. But I should also note that earlier I walked into the kitchen and I went, wow, that smells really good. And Michelle was like, there's nothing in the oven. It's just the burnt oven. And I was like, oh, okay. I really like it. It smelled great.
Yeah. I
But
mean, I was like in the process of making like these, like I was making some cheddar biscuits from scratch.
which were
But like
amazing. Good gosh.
Thank you. Well, I had some chives. I really needed to use those. I had some cheddar cheese. I really needed to use that. And one of like my favorite things to do is to push through the feeling of like, how do I put this? I like getting resourceful. Like I like being like, okay, I've got this, and this, and I need to make something, and I need to make it now because I already cut off a piece of mold from the cheese. So I got to make something with this. And I don't know. There's something like, I don't know. I know there can be something beautiful about like buying the specific ingredients, but I kind of feel like I can sometimes do really well with like getting very resourceful and like what do we have? Let me make something with what we have. Anyways, I was making these cheddar biscuits and then Daniel walks in and I literally had just preheated the oven. Like, I don't know. I mean, last time I checked, like, there's only so much smell that dry flour and butter give off by itself unless you're stuck your nose into it, right? And he's like, oh, it smells so good in here. I was like, he's like, whatever you're making smells so good. I was like, thanks, babe. It's this whatever's at the bottom of the oven that's just
my consciousness was
like
extending into the future, like morphic resonance kind of Sheldrick thing, and I was smelling it from the future. Okay, it was duration. That's what it was, I think.
Yeah. Well, I love what you shared, Philip. That was all really great. This question of the Platonic form. I mean, I think that it's interesting. I was at the library today with the kids, and I was talking to a lady who was probably in her late 70s, and there's something about like, she was saying it just comes with the territory. She was saying about her eye, like her eye started watering while she was talking to me, and she was like, I got my cataracts removed a couple of years ago, and like it happens ever since, and they just said it just kind of happens, it's just kind of part of it. And her back, she was talking about her back. She wasn't complaining, but she brought up little things, and she was like, it made me think about how aging is not for the faint of heart, and like when you're so young, you feel so invincible. Or like before I was married and had kids, I felt so invincible. I didn't really worry about dying. I was very carefree. And then, when you actually have people who are like relying on you, or like there's more stakes, or there's a huge responsibility, it's like, oh my gosh, it's like you actually have to deal with anxiety and like worry and like, but still learn to be able to not let it not succumb to those feelings. And I don't know, I guess that's just ultimately what maturation is, I suppose. But it's like, it's really important to kind of honor every season of life and recognize its difference and its fleetingness too. And its power. But I was thinking about like relationships because I have this friend who's always like, it's a girl, and she's like, and that's great with the philosophy and all, but at the end of the day, like, if a guy's a good guy, he's going to do this. And, and I get where she's coming from, I really do. But there's something to me that's like, but if you go to some different culture or time period, what would that thing that you think is so obvious wouldn't be so obvious, Like if your man's drafted and he's in a war, is he still a supportive husband, even though he can't be there with you to help tuck the kids in? Like, stuff like that, where it's just like, I understand, I get it. Like there's a way in which we can kind of, it can be used, philosophy even itself can be used as like, kind of a way to, you can just talk about it and never do the thing, right? But I think the most powerful philosophy is and the real philosophy, or the good philosophy, like in the Humean sense, is like where you think this stuff and you talk the stuff out, and then you actually do this stuff. But I don't know, I guess it just got me thinking about a Platonic form. And I think what it made me think about is how particular relationships are, and how only you can really know if you're not being vulnerable enough, or if you're not asking for help when you need it, or if you're asking for too much help and kind of getting entitled about it, like all that stuff. So, but like that, I do think you can escape like a degree of philosophy to navigate those waters of the relationship. Because if you just always think about the standard, well, you could easily just start to be like always thinking that, I don't know, like that it could be this other thing. Well, what is it? What is it actually? And can you like foster a gratitude for what is, and also work through the things that you still may need to work through, as we all do for all of time. We'll have things to work through. Can you do that? Can you do that in your particularity? So yeah, that's what I was thinking about. Hey, Ebert.
Delightful, Alex. Good to see you. And I'll pass it to Michael here. No, I think that's very interesting. I mean, because there's that idea like, okay, so a man is sent off to war to fight. Is he still supporting? There's this notion, like Philip was saying, that having this sense of timing and different things. And it really does go to show you, like, Ivan Illich or Simone Weil on this notion of kind of paying attention. And is the act of attention basically necessary by which to deal with relationships? And if you don't have that, then it seems like you're basically going to end up just being swept up in various dramas or problems and not even know it. So I think that's an important point, but let me give it to Michael here. And Michael, it is good to see you. Thank you for coming by this evening.
It's great to be here. I wanted to pick up on something Michelle said about, like, once you have kids, once you get married, you come into contact with, like, I guess kind of the anxiety of your own mortality, because your sphere of influence has like increased, and your sphere of like human beings who are dependent on you has increased. And so where you might be a carefree bachelor beforehand who kind of is acting primarily out of like a self-preservational kind of like mode. Now you're thrust into like, oh, I have people who depend on me, and like I should probably get my life in order to some degree to like meet that responsibility. Something that I've thought about a lot is like, like trying to get to the point where you care about the future before you have a family. And for me right now, I'm like single, mid-20s, and like over the last couple of years, like the way I take care of my body, like the food that I eat, um, the people that I hang out with, the substances that I choose to not put in my body, like it's all, I've had this like real change in like how I organize my life. And it, I think part of it's due to like this imagined future that I want to have with a family, with a community around me, and wanting to have a sense of vitality and have a sense of like, oh, I actually know that I'm gonna be healthy and like engaged in the world for like a long period of time. But there's also this kind of piece about like aspiring towards virtuosity, and like I'm reading this book right now, Aspiration by Agnes Callard. And kind of one of the core tenets in that book is like when we aspire towards a virtue or a value, we don't yet possess it. And so we're aspiring towards something that we don't yet have. And so the in the kind of movement towards having the thing, we're in this kind of limbo period where like we know it's something we want, but we don't yet have it. And so because we don't yet have it, it's not like second nature. And we do all of these things to like, she was talking about like, someone who wants to value music, but doesn't yet, it's not yet like lighting them on fire. Will like go to a concert and they'll like catch themselves like dozing off to sleep maybe, and they'll like pinch themselves awake. And like the act of pinching yourself awake is like evidence that you don't yet second naturally value this thing, but you want to value this thing. And so I'm really fascinated right now by like how we come to want to aspire towards something. Because I think and you talk about beauty a lot, and I know Thomas Jockin talks and is having a course on beauty. Like I think to aspire towards something, you have to have this strike of beauty that because if it's something that you haven't yet intentionally strived towards, you most likely won't voluntarily move towards the thing. The thing will move towards you. And so, for me, for example, like I just had these strikes of beauty in nature that were kind of unexpected. And they were very like mundane's not the right word, but ordinary. Like I was at a local preserve and I, was sitting on a log and all these ants were crawling on my legs. And I was just noticing the beauty of all of these ants that were like, traversing my leg hairs and trying to help each other up and, kind of the colony kind of working in harmony. And that led me to, my last two jobs have been in conservation, have been working outside. And so, yeah, I'm really curious about this kind of like aspiring towards virtue. And are we always in a sense aspiring towards virtue? Like, I feel like Socrates probably would say, if you feel like you've obtained a certain virtue, you probably don't have it. Or that's probably precisely the moment when you've lost it because you're not yet, you're not captivated by the longing or the beauty of it. Like, you feel like you've kind of contained the whole thing and it kind of loses its like essence, or something. But yeah, I'll pass it back.
Delightful. Well, I appreciate it. And I'll pass it to Philip and then Mr. Ebert and then Mr. Jockin. It's good to see you. And Teton, you might be up at 7 in the morning or 5 in the morning. I'm not sure, but it's good to see you. And Andrew Luber, I think that's a wonderful question on, and it's good Mr. Jockin came in on how do we want to aspire to something? Where does an aspiration come from? I suppose it was happening upon Final Fantasy VI on the Super Nintendo that made me want to write the Sword of Tribulation or take walks in the woods, that then made me interested in what exactly is a tree. And then somehow that led into philosophy. And it is very interesting if you try to follow the history of what exactly compelled you to aspire towards something. And, it just happens to be some cookie that Proust touches that makes him go back into the past, right? Or it's some vision of Caddy climbing into a tree and then Faulkner has to write The Sound and the Fury. There's a sense in which there's a certain, this kind of very powerful incentive that seems to set people's life course, almost has a certain happenstance, a certain glimmer and glimpse, to use a term that we'll talk about that is so important. Like, who knew that ants crawling on your leg could decide your adult life? Who knew, right? But it's very interesting because when you read biographies of people's story, there is that kind of mystery. And I was speaking with Matt Segal, and something I've been reading, it's kind of in economics that really blows my mind. And I read him a number of years ago, and then I'll pass it to Philip and Alex. There's this man named Robert Solow, and he's famous for long-term steady growth models. And something he talks about, it's called the Solow residual. And what that is basically once you model capital fluctuations, and then you model labor, and then you model, of course, it's a lot of things you have to model, but if you model incentive structures, then there's about 20 to 50% of productivity that you cannot explain, which means there's 20 to 50% of activity in an economy that determines how people act and what they produce that is beyond modeling, which is pretty wild to think. And it's called the Solow residual. And what's very important about this is basically what Robert, kind of says is, well, a lot of this is due to technological innovation, creativity, and other things that seem to occur mysteriously, and we're not sure how they happen. But basically that means 20 to 50. Now, some people critique the residual because they say that it's such a wide percentage that it's kind of useless. And also, if you ask people, well, what is the residual in economics, this Solow residual, they say, it's everything left over. Oh, well, what's left over? Well, we don't know. There's just this huge Gödel point of economics that we can't explain. And I wonder how much of it are actually incentive structures beyond the market incentives that we're used to, like ants crawling on your legs, or visions of beauty, or Final Fantasy VI that shoot you off, which is very, very important, because then if economics heads towards stagnation, it naturally does if it's relying on stimulating demand versus creating demand, then it's really important that we get a better sense of what it means to want to aspire, what brings about those different things. So I appreciate it, but let me get to Philip and then Mr. Ebert. Mr. Philip Shinn.
Yeah, I feel like so much of that, even like what we have to unlearn from everything that's kind of been culturally programmed, like Michelle was saying, like just the ability to pay attention. Zach Stein will talk about a crisis in attention. And I do think there, without sounding too much like a geezer, like is an appreciable difference between someone who has spent 10 years watching 1,000 10 to 60-second videos on their phone, rather than someone, who kind of grew up with, I don't know, AOL dial-up or something like this. So it seems like in order to be able to aspire to something, a certain amount of focus, and it seems to need to have like an uninterrupted quality. Maybe it doesn't need to. Maybe like something new is emerging, but at least like alongside all the particularities we have in our relationship, we have representations of ideals that we're kind of like trying out, and it's even like not just like the Hollywood stuff, but like Daniel has the idea of what an ideal man is. Michelle has an idea of what an ideal woman is. And like until you go in and start playing with those, which can get strange because sometimes in the relationship someone will say like be a man, or like come on, like this is like an interesting moment where it can become rules that you guys start making up within the relationship rather than accepting everything that's going on outside. And that takes a joint attentional activity. And if someone's like attention span is 30 seconds, like I wonder sometimes like what Plato's attention span, like could he just like think for like 6 hours a day? I don't know. And then he's like, oh, it's time to eat or something. I wonder sometimes, because I know like I'm reading Schopenhauer right now. I know that he didn't really need like a job. And he said in order to be a philosopher, like large swaths of time is super important. But he was like, if you're a poet, it'd actually be better to have like a job where you're kind of forced to do it. So you just have a little bit of time to do your poetry and you get it all out. But yeah, just like attention as the main lever to pursuing virtue.
I'm sure that his poet neighbor really liked that when he's up there spending all this time and he's like, it's what you need as he's leaving for work at 5 a.m. I'm sure his poet friend really loved that. I'll pass it to Mr. Ebert. I love what you were saying on those notes of play, but right there, like in order to enter into the space of play or experimental to work with those different models or ideas or different forms, as Michelle was saying, first off, there's a certain hitting the limit, to reference freak theory, on what preset ideas of what something should look like has to occur, which of course requires you to be able to handle the limitation of your preset ideas. But if you can overcome that, there's a certain limitlessness that can arise in that very experimental and figure out the relationship, which then, there's something about that opens possibility of beauty, but then also in that beauty, there's something abyssal, because it is, in fact, well, it's just kind of experimental. It's just kind of play. Then isn't it arbitrary? But in that very arbitrary, there is the possibility of, development. But it is interesting because there is something about attention, the ability to keep up with the game, with how things are unfolding, just like having to pay. You couldn't do jazz improvisation if you weren't paying attention. That seems really, really necessary. But we don't, but then that would suggest that we need to emphasize, maybe there's a lot of people that talk about communication in relationship, but not necessarily attention. And what does it look, attention becomes the pre-move that determines what you communicate or what you're communicating about or the range of communication. So and maybe Socrates did have a 6-hour attention span. That would be interesting. I wonder how long he could wrestle as well. Isn't like Plato mean like broad shoulder? He was a good wrestler or something. So hard to say. But let me pass it on to Mr. Ebert. Mr. Ebert, I hope you are doing well today.
All right. I'm doing good. Something Michelle said, something came to my mind, and I guess it's apropos of J.D. Vance, the chosen vice president for Trump, VP pick, said something like childless people shouldn't be in charge of the country because they have no sense of, duty, like immediate, visceral, phenomenological sense of duty to anyone, and so on. And then I may have misunderstood what Michelle was saying about if you have children, you're sort of forced to confront the future and think more about the future. And whether or not she said that, I think she said something like that. That's a common sentiment, is this idea that once you have kids, you really get viscerally engaged. You have skin in the game, like actual DNA. You have flesh in the game of the future. But I found the opposite, and I wonder if what I've found as the opposite also explains why sort of the J.D. Vance sort of like the conservative family axis, and also sort of explains why the youth are represent the preponderance of liberals, and that people tend to get more conservative as they get older and they have more family and so on. And it's actually that my own experience is that when I was younger, I was before I had kids, I was all about the future. In fact, I was all about everybody. I was all about everybody else. I was all about I was like a card-carrying socialist, and I was extremely pro-social and extremely futuristic in my thinking, and an extreme environmentalist, and so on. And there's probably some combination of having a kid and also aging, but let's just say that it has something to do with having a kid, which has bound me to the present moment and present need in a way that constricts and limits my engagement with futuristic needs. There is an increased selfishness, and my selfishness has actually increased having a kid. I'm much more inclined to sort of take up a NIMBY attitude, not in my backyard attitude. Like, yes, I would love good things to happen, but not in my backyard, not near my kids. You know what I mean? Yes, I would love that low-income housing, but not around my kids, and so on. And so there is a link between parenthood and conservatism, I think, and actually a constriction of the futuristic lens, which places attention on present needs, and begins to eat away at or even erode a more futuristic set of ethics, and sort of bend that lens, that ethical lens, back into the present moment, where a lot of those futuristic concerns, the abstracted concerns of environmentalism and so on, actually begin to ironically fade away under the weight of the child caring responsibilities, especially economic concerns. Like it's very easy when you don't have a kid to say, well, charter schools are shit because money gets unfairly and disproportionately allocated to certain areas and not other areas, and so on and so forth. But once you have a kid, you're actually quite happy that an asymmetry of funding has landed in one particular and peculiar spot, because that's precisely where you want to send your kid. And it's better because it got more money, because it's better. And all of a sudden, forfeiting, railing against that school and forfeiting the asymmetry for a more equanimity, is no longer at the top of your list. And all of a sudden you see the benefits of asymmetry. And suddenly you see, well, okay, yes, I guess the world is to some extent not fair. And I guess to some extent we can't cure that fairness, because if we were to cure the fairness, what we'd end up with is a phenomenologically flat experience. So all these things are fascinating, because I just love the irony that you have kids, and instead of then thinking about the future and the generations and their generations and the generations after their generations, you actually have less wherewithal to think that way, because your concern is really about your kid now, here. Where are they going to school tomorrow? What are we eating tomorrow? Where are we living? Do we have a roof? Whereas when I was single, it was like roof schmoof. I could be a homeless person, no problem. I'll forfeit everything. But all of a sudden you have kids, and it's like, well, okay, that's rude. That would be rude for me to do, right? So I find that I am ironically sort of more selfish. Now all of this is in line also with the difference between the conservative and liberal generally, which is that the conservative mind frame is more now and here, and is more focused on, yeah, but what can you do for me now? Like, yes, I hear that you want to make everything great in the future, and you have all these abstracted ideas of social equality, but what am I getting now? And it's very easy when I was younger to be like, okay, you're a selfish person and you have no imagination. But then you get older and you have kids, and suddenly you have real concerns, and you're like, okay, well, I sort of get it now. Yeah, I'm just curious to see what. Anyway, I just wanted to throw that out there, that there's sort of an inverse relationship between caring for someone who is the future generation versus caring about the future.
That's fascinating. I really like that point. I'll give it to Chetan here, because there is an interesting difference between thinking about the future in more of almost an imaginative sense, or like an imaginative, not as a, but like thinking of different possibilities of what the future could be, versus making sure your kids have a future. Like having a future and asking about the future are not the same. And then what's very interesting is it's almost like you need to have the ability to have kids without losing that capacity to imagine what the future could be while providing for their future. But it is very difficult to maintain both of those at the same time. And with time, as you're just overwhelmed with, restraints on time, money, or different things, you're just like, well, let's just focus on their future. And like you say, like that then actually has a certain selfishness that occurs, a certain tunneling. Like, okay, is the money going to our school district? Great. Is it going toward a new way of doing school? Doesn't matter. Let's just make sure they have a future. And that actually, I think, does point to, well, we've talked about it before, that just because you say have a system that is providing profit or different things doesn't mean necessarily that you're going to have wealth. The very conditions that are taking care of everyone's singular child may actually limit what the future could be, which then, if there's something about that sort of imaginative thinking that falls within actually what you need for the solo residual, or the ability for ants to actually inspire you into different things, then you're closed off into those sources of generating the future in the name of making sure that your kids have a future. There is a very interesting tension there that has to be thought, which does, I think, suggest that having kids, we should not assume that having kids necessitates the act of imagining the future, or thinking about possibilities of the future. It could simply be thinking about making sure kids have a future within a preset frame, which, you know, that preset frame could just be serving what already is existing. So that's a very interesting point, Mr. Ebert. I appreciate it. I'll give it to Chetan here. Chetan, please, it's good to see you, sir. I hope you are doing well.
Yeah. It's really good to see you all also. I think Ebert's point is a brilliant point, and it sort of provokes me to maybe think with him to some degree in that regard. I'm thinking about Hannah Arendt here, and Arendt sort of places politics as a problem between, the private and the public realm, where the private realm is a question of survival and public realm is, is a question where survival as a problem cannot enter. It's only then this idea of opening up to future and so on and so forth, enter into politics in that sense. If people hold opinions without concerning for them, which is why for her, both these realms are equally important for each other. Either of the realms sort of gets corrupted, the other also gets corrupted. And I think the way Ebert is sort of thinking about this problem of the child over here is in some senses opening up both these realms for certain kinds of investigation in that sense. Definitely, a child can be in some contexts. For instance, I work with poverty, and I've been trying to write about poverty from past few days in the question of politics. It is possible that when a person is already inhabiting a space which is asymmetrically deprived in that sense, there having a child can open you up for certain futuristic thinking, because there, it can force you to sort of think outside of yourself about somebody else, and child can become, and I've seen that happen. And vice versa, it can also sort of make you close back down into your own private sphere and say, okay, I don't care about my public sphere because I'm already in that. And child is an interesting problem of access in that sense. Child is always, in this sense, access to language. Child always knows things that language cannot accord it to in some senses. Child is an interesting problem in that regard. And what does it open up, open itself to is always unpredictable. It's always something which we can't sort of preordain what it will bring into this world. The child itself is, in that sense, this position or this point of something new coming into this world. But I completely agree with Ebert that there is no guarantee that having a child will always give you this openness towards some kind of progressive or left thinking. On the contrary, it can many times, or at least most of the times, this idea of centering your politics upon family or child will take you to some kind of conservative thought at some point. And it's an extremely interesting provocation to really think about. Thank you, Alex. It would make me think more upon my own writings in that sense on this regard. Yeah.
No, I think it's fascinating. And then something where there's imagination without facing anxiety, maybe. Like you start off, there's kind of an imaginative of what could be, but not having the right skin in the game, not having anxiety. You're not really bound to anything. Like Michelle will tell you, Mr. Ebert, I did maybe sleep in a car for a month or take a bucket bath for a long time because, yeah, who cares? You don't need a roof. You're just fine, right? You can do that, right? I hear now if you do that, it's frowned upon for some reason. But, there's more of a sense of you can just make work. Like you're going to make work whatever happens. So you're really just kind of limited by your imagination, if you just grant that as kind of a phrase here. But then when you have kids and you're like, oh, I can't sleep in my car. You have to provide for them. You have to be thinking about those different things. There's a certain bringing you into making sure that tomorrow is provided for. But then in that act, it's almost like you get the anxiety there's something good about facing anxiety. But then what you can do is say, the anxiety is so difficult, and I don't even know what it means to have imaginative anxiety. So I'll just cut out the imagination and just worry about their future, right? There's almost some kind of third, as we talk about the return to common life, or kind of passing from impulsiveness to socialization to creativity, all these different ways to put it. It's almost like, what would it mean to have space for imagination on the other side of anxiety, on the other side of having responsibility for kids or for the world that you're going to move into the future. And it seems like rather than think that, or some sort of ability to bring anxiety and imagination together, if that's maybe one way to put it, instead what we do is say, let's not worry about the imaginative. Let's just take care and make sure that the kids have a future tomorrow. But that's not necessarily, then what that means is you're just stuck in whatever pre-existing frame you have, which is not so much about the future in a sort of possibility sense, but simply making sure that your kids are able to participate in the preset system. I'll give it to Mr. Jockin and then Mr. Luber. Mr. Jockin, please.
Good to see everybody. You know, this is Ebert coming with the strong points. Okay. I think let's circle. I'm going to circle back with some other comments too. I think it all connects because I'm going to stand hard. I think most people are slavish by nature. What I mean by that is that these mechanisms, there's a reason why we have law, and I always say this. There's a reason why we have two ethics, right? From Aristotle, and one concludes to the politics, and one concludes with theology. There's a reason why this happens because he says the rule when man cannot be ruled by his own principles. He has to be coerced into loving the good and the just and hating the evil from law. Law has to be used to correct them. I think for a lot of individuals, I know friends and colleagues who have children, absolutely children are a forcing mechanism of necessity onto them. They're no longer allowing to sit in abstractions or just in self-delusion or whatever. They have to deal with impositions on them and generally related to survival. And quite frankly, the issues of your ethics, especially in this kind of full liberalism of, yes, we should have full equality. Yes, everyone should have equal access to everything. But now when something comes down to your biological necessity and imperatives, all of a sudden, whoopsie-daisy, this is it's a kind of, oh God, who's this? I've seen him on Twitter a lot. It's a kind of luxury belief. There you go. That's the term. The luxury beliefs. Basically, they're status signals to signify a certain status position. But then once necessity got put onto you, they got jettisoned immediately. Now, I think one part of this, to be fair, I mean, and sitting here with this commentary, because, yeah, I think the idea of children as some kind of moral virtue mechanism is part of a idealism of family values, huge, gigantic air quotes, because what does that signify? There's a kind of I think it was Philip who talked about this idea of like, the problem is when we say like we rely on the social norms to guide our moral stances all the time. To say, be a man. Which kind of man we're talking about? What kind of reference point are we making? What icon? What symbology? What idealism are we referring to? Most people don't even think about it. They don't even have a second thought of what that implies or means. But as I talked with Michelle about this, about the icons, that's actually a very live creative choice about what representation, what the portrayal of womanhood, manhood, or in this case, family, do we mean? Do you mean the idealized 1950s of conservatism, of what that is, nuclear family, that argumentation? Do you mean the multi-generational family model, for example? Which one is it? That has a huge effect on those images and those portrayals of orientation and the presentation of family values as the orientation, like this argument of, oh, you're going to be such a morally excellent person by having children. That's not guaranteed. In fact, actually, a lot of times, children were this gigantic nuisance. Plato point blank says in Phaedo, he's like, oh, these children, whatever. Don't worry about it. Oh, no, it's Credo. He talks about that too. Actually, in both cases, he says this children stuff is like not some moral excellence for Plato, where he's having this betrayal, like this. It's an area of concern. Actually, that's interesting, by the way, Ebert's bringing up that, because this question of Socrates had the choice to escape and be with his children and finish the raising of his children. He said, no, I'm not doing that. Other people can handle that. I have something more important to serve, right? Just basically honoring of justice. I do think that really stands out in terms of our ideal, like I'm presenting that to show our orientation of family and children in particular has changed. It definitely is. It's an icon. And what that portrayal is has a huge effect, but most times it's not thought about, especially under coded language of conservatism, the way it gets presented. I'm just riffing on that point. I think that's quite interesting, just to connect with Philip's talking about our relationship with creativity of thought with models and images we're working with. I do think there's an interesting part, though, is on a particular points about the nature of justice being the same, that sameness and equality equals justice, when one can make an argument that the issue of difference is actually the nature of justice, meaning we should treat things as they appropriately should be, which entails difference. Justice as equality actually one can make an argument, imposes an artificial imposition, when difference is, which one is the fundamental part of reality? Is justice meant to correspond to reality of everything being equal, or things being different? There are consequences if you have if there's different opinions, because as Ebert pointed out, people who have an argument of a luxury belief of equality of everything, all resources, all distributional justice should be equal. With us, when their children come involved, and now they want these privileging of resources because they want to make sure their children survive. That's a tension point right there that at minimum is a contradiction and hypocritical. Maximally, it might be a complete misconception what justice is, to go really strong with that stance. It's a question mark. I put that out there because I think that's a consequence. On a more fair point, I think on a particular issue, because by both Daniel and what Ebert's saying, it's one thing when we suffer. It is something different when our children suffer. And I think one could make an argument that's pure, that could be selfishness in the sense of like the pain. It's similar to when we see someone we love suffer versus our own suffering. It just adds an extra level dimension of striking of yourself, of the injury, when it's not just your own self that has to suffer the consequence of being in the car freezing, for example, when your children are there. I sit there because I meditate. I chew on that. I chew on that because I think about that, and I put that in context of a Plato's complete indifference of his children. That's I could sense my own kind of emotional resonance to that question, and I'm sensing a contrast there. I'm thinking about that, and what that signifies. But I think the larger point is that I think the forcing mechanism of time, preferences, and wisdom are a very important property here. For most people, if they follow that model of family values, what happens is that they just become useful. They get forced into a forcing mechanism to operate in a shorter time span of necessity to operate following the social norms that's exposed onto them. I think it is a fair critique, what he was pointing out. I think that's generally, I tend to be the case. This kind of abstractional thinking of multi-generational long-term wisdom, I think that's a different presentation of family or presentation of thinking that is, I don't think necessarily is guaranteed with family. I think Ebert's true with that. But I think it relates to kind of what Philip's saying. It's your reference point. What's the icon we're referring to in our understanding of family? And actually, I think it was Michael brought this point up. I jumped in on this, right? That's on that point of aspiration for virtue. Plato talks about this in Symposium. There's a difference between that possession, and as Michael was talking about, that everlasting possession of the beloved, that's all presented as good as like having goods and having the everlasting possession of them. And that kind of feeling of when you possess it completely, there's a kind of running away. It runs away from you. Plato makes notes of that. And especially on the question of I think that was intuited by that point of the possession of the beautiful was omitted. It said younger Socrates could not answer that question to Diotima about that. I think that's what Michael's pointing out was very much mimicking that thinking, what Plato was talking about. Yeah, so I think I'm curious what Ebert has to say on my points, because I think he's bringing some really fascinating, contrasting contentions. And I yield.
Yeah, this is making me just think that I just to note that the having kids, and again, I'm referring to my own experience, but riffing on this, is that the will to transcendence has been recalled into the body of my child. Where the child is the transcendence.
Yeah.
And the former will to transcendence, which was wild and felt rather unlimited, unbound, and was dead set on a paradigmatic transcendence. Upon the birth of my child, was essentially recalled into the flesh. And I almost cannot access my will to transcendence now. And it's very, very interesting. Yeah.
No, I think it's a brilliant point, and I really appreciate it. I'll give it to Mr. Lubier. I mean, as you're speaking, there's a few things that come to mind. It's almost as if there's almost a sense where people's like, if you have kids, there's a certain virtue that necessarily creates, that thus gives authority, and this actually leads to all sorts of family dramas, right? Because there is this sense where the male, for example, can be like, well, I've raised kids, therefore what I think goes. But since it is not necessarily the case that virtue has been developed from the kids, because basically I think the point, there's a real sense in which there are no guarantees that anything just necessarily magically creates virtue, if you will, in the way that Jockin is talking about it. But there's a way in which we almost can convince ourselves, if we raise children, we therefore develop virtue, which then gives us a kind of authority if we, say, crush the child into our ideas of what the future should be. And then also, because we have shrunk our will to transcendence into them, the notion of letting the child develop, say, because they have ants crawl up their legs and they're going to go do something else. You're like, well, that's impractical. That's not going to do any well. It would be like you lose your will to transcendence, right? Like you would lose your kind of confirmation that your discernment is in fact right and virtuous, because you wouldn't have thought to have let them do that, right? And you would have to kind of die to this notion that you have necessarily developed virtue in having children, in them doing something different from yourself. And so that creates various pathologies. And I think what's interesting about this is it's as if you have a kind of free-floating, non-skin in the game form of a will to transcendence. Then you have kids, and that brings the will to transcendence to the concrete, skin in the game, and there's some good to that. But then how do you not let it get stuck in the child in a manner that actually, in a way, crushes the child into your will of transcendence, right? Like, how do you let them actually kind of flourish in terms of their own imagination? That's really hard. And that's not necessarily given. And that kind of speaks back to Michelle's point of watching, like we were saying at the beginning, having a certain attention, a certain awareness to kind of calibrate to the development. But Mr. Ebert, please.
I just wanted to add on that, and also to what Jockin said about the two terminating ethical sets, one to politics, one to theology. And if we're going to stick with this idea of transcendence, the idea that the unbound transcendence, let's just say the childless unbound transcendence, in which you have a paradigmatic will to transcend the paradigm that you're born into, terminates in God. And then the flesh, the embodied transcendent, right? The descendant, but the transcendent, terminates in the state, or in whatever apparatus protects that embodied transcendent. And I don't know what Jockin would have to say to that, but that would imply basically to me that essentially theology is sort of born of the domain of youth, or of unbound will to transcendence. Mm-hmm. And the state is born of the domain of the parent, the embodied transcendent.
I think it is fundamentally, Daniel, your comment, and Ebert, your circulation on that. This is really important, because isn't that what it comes down to? Is the idea of a tyrant is someone who imposes authority unjustly, because they are not orienting their actions and their commands to the principles. The principle itself, it's a fiat coal of molding, of imposing. So the only way this can be, it seems like the issue of pathology, if one is not oriented in true virtue, is in it's basically guaranteed in some pathology to generate. What I'm getting at here is the imposition of a form onto things as a good. So this is the idea of the capture of the beautiful by good. This is articulation of it, because what happens is, instead of the form being generated of that, basically the idea that that child gets generated through its own development, and then finding that the parent has a role to play, but not directly imposing it, because the possession, because that's the thing, that child becomes a project of what was once channeled. That will was channeled once transcendently outside, has not been made concrete into this child, into this body, there's a huge potential danger of imposition, right? That can get malformed in some variation or way, even with good intention. I do think that that's the issue, is that fundamentally, it's the like you have to almost have this orientation of wisdom in the sense of like of loss of possession in a bizarre way. I'm not a parent yet, so obviously, listen, this is a huge crux, but I'm kind of chewing on this. I'm sensing what's at stake here, and what seems to be at stake is that question of basically that whose will you're honoring, which principle, what are you orienting it around? Is your child a project of yourself, which by the way a lot of parents do, that totally happens, or is this, or you get the privilege of an opportunity to participate? I chew on that. Listen, I say this with some serious, strong senses of realizing the real pragmatic point. Children crying, the testimony, the trials that this child's going to impose. I don't know. I sit here and chew on that, but I do think I'm showing how quickly obvious the youth, like the tension of not channeling, because that's what he says, and Aristotle says about theology in the end. It's the honoring and awareness of God in all your activities, which means the idea that there's a principle of orientation. It's not you, it's outside you.
Yeah.
Versus the kind of channeling and forming of things by an imposition of an image. That'd be my answer to that, but I don't hear anyone's thoughts about that. Still
very quickly, the little allegory about Socrates saying, no, it's okay, like my kids will be fine, is emblematic in a way of the him sort of staying focused on the transcendent as opposed, or the transcendence as opposed to the transcendent. I just think instead of necessarily interpreting that, and historically this may be inaccurate, but instead of suspending history, interpreting that as Socrates keeping his eye on the ball as opposed to a function of the society of the time, I think might be interesting.
No, it's a lovely comment. I'll give it to Luber, Teton, Michael, and Philip. And just as a quick note, I'm now thinking of the categories of responsibility, virtue, and imagination. And it's almost like without virtue or attention, or however we want to word it, if you're given responsibility, you kill imagination. And you have to somehow keep all three, and it's very difficult to do that. Like once you get the responsibility of the kid, it's almost out without this kind of virtue that would allow you to put the will first, or to not let them become an embodiment of your will to transcendence in a way that's problematic. You have to have a certain virtue to not let the event of responsibility kill imagination or the capacity of that release. But that's just a thought. But let me give it to Mr. Luber. Mr. Luber, it is good to see you, sir.
This is a very interesting conversation, and I'm probably the youngest one here, and furthest away from having a child here. I definitely want a child, but so I guess like what Jockin said, basically more or less take what I say with a grain of salt. But screw it. So I mean, Ebert, what you were saying actually made me think the inverse. Like what you're describing to me, you sound completely selfless. Like when you say you're focusing on the now in that way, it's like you're not focusing on you're focusing on the now as it pertains to your child. Like it's like a certain type of like myopic concentration focus, because you're just, I don't know, this is the only way I can think of it at the moment, is just because you're just so in love with your child, like that you can't even think beyond the now in a certain sense. That makes me excited personally, just hearing that. But I think what's selfish is when people aren't thinking in terms of the now and thinking about the future abstract ideas that don't really pertain to the now. That sounds like the most selfish to me, because it's so in their head. It's totally self-consuming, where the now seems like it's not, it's self-consuming. It's like what Daniel, it's what you always say. It's the absolute plus you in a certain sense. So like, to me, it sounds very selfless. And then, yeah, like, I think the question of, well, one, the point, it's hard. I think it's harder to be virtuous as a parent for that reason. Like it's almost easier to be, virtuous when when your entire world is just consumed on you and your own abstract thoughts about the future. I think basically I think it's really hard to be virtuous when you're thinking through the now, like in that Hegelian way or in this parent way. I mean, it's the same, like to compare it how I thought of it was with story, shockingly. And I was just thinking it's so selfish when there's a creative that in a certain sense is strangholding the theme, or just they're not thinking in terms of any structure. They're thinking abstractly. Like to think through structure inherently means to think through the now. Like that's it, like that's a constraint for thinking about structure itself, because you can't think about structure in pure abstraction. It always has to deal with some particular, and it's typically a particular thought or thing that's present in front of you. So there's that. I think you're more selfless, and it challenges you to be more virtuous. And I think whenever you're in a position where your virtue is being challenged, you're crossing a threshold of selfishness to selflessness in a certain sense. Like whenever there's something where you're in a bind of sorts, it's because those two those two paradigms, those dichotomies are clashing, and you feel the urge to maybe cross from one to the other, so to speak. And then I had a other comment. So where's the value? The question of value in this conversation was very interesting. When you are like, I think I'm as a not parent, what I value is very clear to me. It's very easy, transparent to me. I think when you're a kid, when you have a kid, from my experience of looking at other parents, it's very hard to know what to value, because first of all, some people might not have that phenomenological experience where they feel that type of responsibility and they can't think through the now with their kid. And in that sense, they can sit back and kind of neglect being a parent. There's that aspect too, because I think, yes, like having a kid does give you a constraint for most people that are sane, but I do think there's people that are insane in a certain regard, in the sense that they don't feel that constraint once they have a kid. It's like, okay, the next day, and I keep going, which is like fucked, but whatever. Anyway, I just think when you have a kid in question, what's to value is a certain principle that you were kind of always following yourself, but you realize the horizon of what that principle is changes. And I think that's a challenge, because I think you have to kind of discover what that new horizon is. And I think the value becomes obscure at that point, because you're both on a self-discovery of figuring out what that value is. And I feel like once you kind of find it, they're an adult at that point. Like I feel like it's a constant, like I feel like just because I'm closer to being a kid than all of you, I'm guessing. Yeah, I think the irony is that you can't really have a definitive value. Like you kind of find one when you're an adult, and I think that finding one as an adult also simultaneously happens with your parent. Like if you are close with your parent, you kind of get to the place where you're like, okay, I now see you as an individual, and like you see me as an individual, and in that sense, like the value that the quote unquote value that was present during the parenting kind of sublated. It kind of saturated and it became just what is, how I see the world and you in a certain sense. So I do think the question of value is very interesting because I definitely think it can't be one thing and it's constantly changing. And then when you kind of see the value, you're not a kid anymore and your parent's not really your parent anymore. And I think that's a very interesting place to be at. And I don't even think a lot of people get there. I think a lot of people start having obscure relationships with their parents because there was such a clear value that was being orchestrated growing up that it didn't actually create the freedom to self-discover and be an individual. And there's resentment in that case, and there's all these negative emotions that come along with that. And yeah.
And I hope that you can hear all the southern outside sounds right now. Like there's actually that giant tree from Forrest Gump right over there where they're sitting. It's really like, you know, like a scene out of the movies. Well, something that comes to mind, this also goes to show, because there's a way, like you're saying, that there's a certain selflessness that is in the parent thinking about the now with the child. But what's interesting is once you get to the part where you need to be able to release them, if you've not been imagining the future beyond them, well, then you can't release them into anything, or what you release them into could be very restrictive. So there's an interesting way in which at that moment of the release, you encounter the limitations of that selfless that's just focused on your child. And then it actually has a certain, like there's a revelation of a certain selfishness in the sense of you were funneling, you were limiting, right? But that notion of the release, like, it's as if you don't do the imaginative work to that point, you can't release them. But what's interesting, and then I'll pass it to Chetan, is like, you know, my mom would just let me like go get lost in the woods for a really long time. And who knew that, you know, people could maybe say that was dangerous and unloving and crazy, but you wouldn't have known that getting lost in the woods for all of those hours as a kid was actually what would result in the value arising of being a crazy kid sleeping in a car doing philosophy and art, right? You couldn't have known that till later. And so, but there had to be that release for it to occur that then actually unveils the value. But what's interesting there is, like you're saying, there has to be a certain, in the stage of the formulation of the child, there has to be a certain ambiguity about the value that is in operation, so that when the release occurs, that you can actually see what that value is, right? But that's really tricky. And it's as if in the act of thinking about the kid's future, you have to simultaneously be imagining the future that you're going to be releasing into. And what is that exactly? And if the ants crawl up their leg and they're intrinsically motivated to become something, will there actually be a sustainable future for them to become that? So it's a very interesting, I think what you're describing is very interesting. And it's almost as if it is just very difficult. It's like there's a siloed selflessness, and then there's a selflessness that is in the release into the imagined, if you will, or the future beyond their future. And they're different in that way. And I think often we can be trained that if we're just thinking about our kids, that's the only level of selflessness we need, when in fact there seems to be another step that needs to be taken seriously. But let me give it to Chetan, then Michael, Philip, and Mr. Ebert. Chetan.
I'm just sort of trying to think along, you know, the path that I think Ebert has led us into. And I think Thomas's provocation of these two forms of ethics is extremely interesting. And I'm wondering, say, you know, when we think about virtue as a question, we forget that virtue is something, I think, that exists between two men or women, whatever. You know, I'm using man as a philosophical. It cannot exist simply between man and the thing. There's something about virtue that involves the other subject into play. How do we understand the structuring of virtue in that sense? No, but if you're only surrounded by things in this world, you know, things as in, not something which you can accord subjectivity with, virtue as an idea sort of starts vanishing from the world itself. It's only because we share this world with others that something like a virtue comes into existence in that sense. How do we think through that kind of a question? Another sort of maybe way to think about the problem of politics and political action comes from that also can exist only between men, between men who have the freedom to give their own opinion in this world. It cannot exist between that I am free to give my opinion, but you are not. That's not politics, that's simply some other in that sense form of engagement. Political action demands this kind of an existence, and this is where two kinds of ethics of Thomas sort of comes in. That one kind of ethics that if you're not able to sort of derive those things for yourself, live an ethical life, you enter into this ethical realm of survival, and where you're forced to do those things for certain other theological reasons in that sense. And it's important to maybe start thinking around this question that maybe one kind of ethics has to sort of lead into theology because they coexist with questions of necessity and survival. In that sense, that there's something about religion that has to formulate ethics alongside necessity and survival, which is why they are messy, they are ritualistic, they are, you need all kinds of these other things because essentially there's ethical life which has to coexist with this part of ourselves, and then there's an ethical life that can exist, which can exist only in language. Minute I bring violence into that the whole world breaks apart. It has to be sort of held together in language. The attention has to be held in language in that sense, where simple entry of the ritualistic or the mechanistic view of life can actually destroy that realm. And that realm always exists in human communities, and no human community can completely exist without having any realm for this kind of ethical way of being in that sense. Child, I think, is an extremely interesting question because I think we need to start thinking around the problem of that. What is the difference between my child and child in general? I think that's Ebert is sort of a discussion between Ebert and Michel sort of asking us to do this kind of a game, because my child in that sense, this idea of possession, this idea of thinking around actually is also a question of possession. And just sort of raising that question, it's equally well a question of possessing something. And possession always sort of again takes you back into question of private life and the necessity and survival and so on and so forth. Child in general, working with children can have a very different problem to be thought about. And both these worlds are equally important. My point is not that one is more important than the other and so on and so forth. In fact, many times the only way ethical life can be guaranteed in a society is when the question of survival and necessity are to some degree taken care of. And many times when your survival and necessity are taken care of, you stop. As Ebert is sort of saying, you stop participating in ethical life anymore. You say, okay, my needs are taken care of. Why should I need to do it? You raise your hand, and it's a very difficult question to think about that. Under what conditions man is in that sense, man actually willingly participates in the ethical world. In that sense, it's not an easy question to ask. And in what conditions man actually forces to sort of act out of necessity, and are these two things always contradictory to each other, or are these things in some senses linked with each other? And what role a child as an entity, existence of child as an entity in this world play in shaping these two forms of ethical life? I'm not sure. I'm just sort of raising these questions.
And I think that distinction between my child and children is fascinating. I think basically, I like also this notion that basically people go, once all the necessities are taken care of, we're good. And they stop thinking the ethical. And in that way, it's almost as if your child or raising a child could almost function as, I don't want to say a kind of evidence to convince you that you have been ethical, when really all that you have done is thought what is needed privately to take care of the necessity of your children or to take care of those goods. But it kind of strikes you as being, I've been a good parent, therefore I am ethical in a broader sense, which are not necessarily the same thing. Now, there's something to be said about not giving a darn at all about your kid's necessity. That seems problematic, but there seems, like you say, to be two different things going on. And I think also basically there's almost this kind of idea that if I take care of my kids and their necessity and you take care of your kids and their necessity, then everything will be taken care of socially. But but the ethical seems to be an awareness that just because you take care of there's almost a difference between providing for every child and the sum of children in the kind of ethical life and the imaginative possibilities that brings about, right? Like thinking the relations versus just everyone taking care of their own individual child. So it's almost like you want to think about your child and children, not just children and not just your child, but your child and children. There seems to be a difference in thinking that way that seems to be moving toward this third step we're suggesting. But let me give it to Michael, Philip, and then Mr. Jock. And Michael, please.
Yeah, I wanted to pick up on something. I think it was you, Daniel, but it might have been Andrew talking about parents needing to do the imaginative work to release their children. And you kind of brought up the example of your mom, letting you go out into the woods and look where that led, right? Thank goodness you're here where you are, a creative genius and, not like terrified of the outside world and, that, thank goodness it had a positive impact. But I was thinking of, and then there was this point about that Andrew brought up about once you see the value. I don't exactly know what came after that, but I think in general he was talking about like seeing the value of aspiring towards virtue and maybe having a family of your own. You have entered a phase where you are now relating to your parent as an individual, and the power dynamic between this kind of authority figure and child starts to dissolve a little bit, and it's much more of an egalitarian relationship where the child now is able to hold a certain burden of the parent's emotional experience that they weren't able to when they were younger, that the parent really benefits from. But I was thinking, like, there are some parents, actually I would probably say most parents, who aren't ready for that, because they have a certain identity about being an authority figure for their children, and knowing, being able to trust that their legitimacy will never get questioned or won't get challenged, that the child will do what they say, that they will have a certain sense of legitimacy and a significant portion of their identity like hangs in that. And so when the child grows up and they start to mature, they start to develop their own thoughts, their own perspectives, they maybe leave the home, they maybe start questioning their parents' authority, but even in like the best of circumstances, when like there's like a healthy maturity and the child goes to their parent and they're like, mom or dad, like, you never really talked about your struggles that you were going through as a child. Like when I was a child, you were always serving me and I really appreciate that, but like, I want to get to know you as a person. I've had the experience, with my mom where she was like, I could tell, and I know now because we've developed our relationship, that she really values that and she really wants that. but I don't think she was ready for it. Like when, you know, a couple of years ago when I like started to kind of try to relate to her in that way. And so I think there's a need for parents to be able to see futuristically that their role, just as the child is dynamic and always changing, they have to as well. And they're interpersonal. And then this goes to something Chetan was talking about, where value exists between men. Right. It reminded me of like Buber's I and thou idea of, you know, that hyphen is the most important part, that these two things that are being related are constantly evolving, constantly becoming, you know, and it demands a certain malleability and flexibility that the parent needs to understand, that there will become a time where their role as a parent right now will have to evolve and change. And then last point before I give it back, there was something interesting going on in the chat with Alex talking about kind of this like exclusionary empathy, this idea that when you have, you know, it's not like excluded to having children, but I think it's heightened when you have children, where if you have the opportunity to save 5 strangers or your one kid, like you will privilege your child over all of those other people. And so is that selfishness, or is that a different type of empathy that I would argue, again, as a non-parent, I would imagine is probably more potent and more intense than this kind of altruistic sensibility that a lot of, you know, kind of young adults have around, like, you know, wanting to serve the world and wanting to, like, you know, serve, right, children in like a general sense. But once it becomes grounded and it's like your child's life at stake, it's like you will run in front of a moving bus to prevent them from, you know, from dying. So that's a really curious thing that I do think about quite often. Is that like a decreasing? Is that a sign that your empathy is decreasing because you value maybe one life over, you know, the broader society? Or is our idea of empathy maybe incomplete, in that we think greater empathy is indicated by the breadth, the stretch of your empathy, as opposed to the depth of it? But I'll pass it back.
No, those are all brilliant points. I'll give it to Philip and then Mr. Jock and a few things. I definitely think that it's super important as the parent to not be forgetting that your children are going to be adults one day. And that you will be like man to man, like ethical, like you're enter into that realm of language with them. And it is very important to think of them existing outside of your authority, because I do think it changes the quality of your interaction with them. So I really like that point. And I also like the point, and there are a million night beetles coming at me. So if like something hits my eye and I scream at the top of my lung, assume I've been killed. So there's this idea as well. I do wonder, honestly, like we've been talking about this releasement. I do strongly feel as if the likelihood of the child coming back and taking care of the parent, if you will, is really tied to if they feel like their parent released them. Because there's a feeling of, oh, you trusted me. Oh, you saw something in me. And so like there's a kind of want to come back, because they've almost moved into the realm of friendship. They've almost moved into the well of seeing something kind of noble there. Whereas if that releasement never occurs, I think it's like, oh, I should go take care of them because it's the right thing to do, and it's like authority based, but then it's law based and can be resent based, right? So I think that release there's something also about that release. And when you mentioned Martin Buber, wherever Javier Rivera is, he looked up because he felt it. He references Buber all the time. But something he has also said that I like is the notion that his relationship with his father changed for the better once he started thinking of his father not as his father, but just a person. Oh, that's just a guy. Oh, and then they're friends, right? Because it removed all the symbolic baggage that actually helped with the relating. Now, whether one thinks of it that way or not, I do wonder if when the child is released by the parent at some point, that actually increases the likelihood that the child can later on relate to them almost in that friendship way outside of the symbolic. And thus it moves into that different phase. So I think there's some connections there. I think also, though, because you're making some really interesting points, and Mr. Ebert in the chat has brought them up as well. If your empathy, there seems to be where you need to go from this kind of dangerous loving humanity that Dostoevsky warns about and losing the capacity to love an individual. Okay, you come to focus on an individual, so your morals get a certain flesh and blood to them, a certain concreteness, a certain ethic. But you see, if your ethical life in this sense requires your child to motivate it, then you almost can't let your child leave. This is where the empty nest, this is where the clutching, because they are the motivation of your ethical life. And I have no idea what wow, there are so many night beetles. Oh my gosh, it's like the plague. Anyway, your ethical life becomes dependent on them being around, and it's almost like you can't release them then, or you have to face that you have no idea how to be empathetic beyond the child. That you're actually kind of your ethical life is limited to that kind of relation, and that seems like it could cause different pathologies. So it's almost as if there's a good in learning how to be empathetic in a very one way, but then there's a problem if that concrete focused empathy becomes a dependency. Like you don't know how to be empathetic beyond the child. You don't know how to move into the realm of ethics or imagination or thinking about the future beyond thinking about the child's future or the child's horizon, right? And that may be actually why one of the reasons why having children is so easy to confuse as being all you need for the development of the ethical life, because then precisely because it creates all of these focused empathies, all these ethical concerns, right? That in the experience makes you feel that way, but it's external from you, right? It's external and you're dependent on that external source. So you've never internalized it. So then when they leave, you see the truth of yourself, and that can be really traumatizing. So you clutch. So there's never that healthy releasement question, but I'll give it to Philip. And yes, there is a really massive question here of releasing your children too early or too long, and the absolute choice and the difficulty of conditionalism. And at the end of the day, you have to take a risk, and you could be wrong. And it's precisely that risk that seems to be a necessary component, though, of development, right? Now, there's more to say on that, but it's an excellent comment. But let me give it to Philip and then Mr. Jock. And Philip Shinn.
I want to just ask the question, like, where economics plays into the ethics, like, because I had a friend whose dad like saw the light when she was 2 and left, and like her mom had to work at like Denny's and Walmart, but he was like, he went on this like, no, I found God, and I'm becoming a preacher, and I think on some level, like, this man who went for the leveling up would be called like a bad nuclear dad, you know? And like, how many people don't live in a zip code where NIMBY is possible? And like, is it then incumbent on everyone else to figure out ways of supporting those children? Because I mean, even this question on the whatever trolley problem thing going on here is like happening pretty much with just like straight up undesirable lives. But it's like, no, I can give my child a desirable life. I could actually probably, you know how like, Jock, and you say you could see someone's tax statement and determine their fate. It's like, I could look at that and determine their kid's fate. And Yeah, I wonder like if it is what we're looking at is like differing forms of kenosis. I know that there's this whole idea of like self-emptying, the divinity included, versus just the sort of Hegelian self-negation. And like I have tried many times to talk with my dad about Marxism. I'm like, hey, Dad, why haven't you ever read Marx? Don't you want to talk with me about things like this? And he was like, bro, like, I paid for your vacations and got you nice things. Like, like, how many, like, what at different ages, like, am I going to go up to like a 2-year old and start like quoting Meister Eckhart, you know? Or are you going to let that kid have like an intuitive perception up to a certain point? Are children really resource dependent up to a certain point? How do we decide those points? Now we have 30, a lot of 30-year-olds living at home. That's actually not that crazy. People used to have multi-generational homes. That was pretty normal for a long time. And so, yeah, I wonder like if the question is to allow the child not just to be a functioning economic, but you want that as well, right? Person that follows the rules and like isn't going to increase the crime. Because I think on some level, the father used to just be like, oh, it's time for me to go to war. And, since Bretton Woods, like what he's doing is like, I'm going to capture income, and that is going to protect and provide. And families get torn apart when people lose jobs. And it's like it can be a very difficult thing to be like, my dad was holding this family together with a job. Like, am I just like, is this family unit just part of the productive arm of an economic system that all of the values that you guys are, trying to give to me are being superseded by, the trauma of the real. And so I think a lot of it has to do with like kind of collectively how we set up the norms of when we want to make it appropriate for children to gain certain types of knowledge. And I think like some of that stuff is happening. Like some people are like, oh, don't allow them to have like phones in their schools. And some people are like, oh, we need to watch like our kids getting into porn too early or something like this. And other people are like, who cares? Like they have to live with that reality. And I think that's where, the men coming together, whether or not they have children, is definitely going to affect, the way that they decide which laws should be enacted. But it'd be kind of cool, to start thinking like, what, like economically, what would a good life in a certain zip code, what would that like bottom line be? And is that maybe the most, or at least an ethical thing to do?
Brilliant. I think the economic is a huge factor in all this. And well, it's one of the reasons why it is understandable why people think that focusing on providing for your children or providing for your family is in fact an incredible ethical accomplishment, because it is so difficult and is so hard, right? But this is almost in a way the cruelty of the situation in the sense of, okay, let's say it really does require working nonstop, no time, energy, slavishly to provide for your family, and that it's reasonable that you never developed the ethics to be able to release, and it's understandable that you weren't able to imagine beyond your child to something broader. Well, you're still going to face the negative consequences of not doing so, right? This is where there's a kind of cruelty to it, where if you're not able to actually think these things that we're describing, then you're not going to have, say, as easily the separation or the child able to see their family is held together by values of one another versus necessity. It also makes me think of the awareness that Michelle was talking about, because it does seem that every child requires different, and it's to Michael's point as well, requires different focuses on when to release them, what to expose them to at what time, and there needs to be a certain awareness of that in the Platonic form. In a sense, is the meeting of that orbit for that child in that way so that they can be conditioned properly. But what that is for your child may not be for the kid down the street, and then you feel naked in that, and then you have to be able to face the anxiety of wondering if that's evidence you're doing something wrong, and that's all, and you're just tired, frick. Like you're trying to pay for the bills and different things. And so I think the economic factor is very real, but then the reality of the inability to develop virtue in this additional sense that we're describing, those consequences are very real. And if you don't develop those virtues, then it may actually contribute to the economic system being what it is that's killing all the time energy. Oh, and now we have a kind of vicious circle that's in operation, especially if the loss of the imaginative moves you to a reliance on the stimulation of demand, not taking into account the solo residual, like we were saying at the beginning, leading to further drop of demand, weakening of wages in favor of assets that then worsen the situation. Philip.
I'm talking like kind of more geopolitically, the banality of evil when it comes to placing children in different parts of the world in harm's way in order to have an ever-growing GDP, and you're a part of that because that's the way that you secure a good life for your child.
Oh no, I think that's also then why there's an information camp, Paul Virilio and different things to keep that outside of your line of thought. Well, so there's two ways to approach that. Either say, well, I'm just going to abandon the kids because I'm not going to take up my kids at the suffering of others. Or if there's a realization of the existence of the suffering, that's just further reason to necessarily enter into that imaginative space that is thinking of all children. That uses as a kind of pushing you into that space to kind of motivate you to figure out how to make those things work. I think taking that seriously can kind of open up those different things. Well, let's put it this way. If you realize that or take that seriously, then the choice between your children or other children is not so simple. It's your children or the expense of other children. It's not merely a matter of focus, but it's actually more perhaps of a zero-sum sort of thing. So I think that has to be taken seriously. But let me give it to Mr. Jockin. And
I think actually, the classical answer to this was summarized later as the principle of proximity. So it's kind of like they kind of apply to economic policy. Knowledge and action needs to be correlated to the closest proximity. The more localized proximity has moral stance over the more abstracted general. What I mean by that is what happens in a province of China, it's unreasonable to expect someone in Michigan to have that much of their amount of moral concern or operation on a province of China when they have concerns in Michigan. It's disproportionate. There has to be some concern, but it's not meant to, it cannot be co-equal. And that's kind of the tension with any utilitarian argument here, right? To say that, well, is it 5 lives? Is it 5 children? Or is it 1 child? Well, first of all, that's presuming there's an equivalency. And that's not necessarily true because you have a proximity relationship to your child, let alone the biological imperative of your child that is different from just a generic 5 children. And especially, again, there's a question, is it 5 children in your neighborhood? Is it 5 children in the state? Is it 5 children in the same country? You see the kind of intensity of the equation changes as soon as you move the proximity of the relationship. So I think that already points out a tension already there on that part. But I do think another part is just, we have to be honest here. Marriage and the structures around it were purely utilitarian at first. There has been development over time. I know Ebert kind of made an argument we should kind of not ignore the historical development side, but unfortunately it's totally true because I think we're missing our understanding. Our understanding is going to get muffled if we don't see that. For example, hey, listen, in Islamic marriage, there's still a contract signing, and there's got to be exchange of goods. A dowry still has to happen. Now, it could be abstracted, and it's different now than it used to be. But listen, for a long time, it's a bunch of goats. You get to trade your goats for a wife. That's how this went. This was an economic transaction. The kind of ontological status is marriage as a basically image of the divine and a kind of operation of that. That's intellectual development that has a foundation in necessity of economic transactions. So this intuition or this kind of noticing that, like, especially when men lose their job function, their economic power function, it destroys the relationship. But the answer is yes, it has to, because the foundation of that relationship was on an economic stability structure. It was. It's the same reason why no one likes hearing this, but unfortunately, from a pure, again, this operation of seeing it this way, if a child cannot be born, if children cannot be propagated, the marriage is defunct because its function's been broken. But notice that, see that right there, the fact that when we ask the question, when we see about virtue and function and essence, there has to be, what's the end? What's the purpose of this relationship, of this interaction? And if child raising and generation of children is omitted, because we see it with other stances now, companionship, moral development, I think generally a stance of, ideally, the theological account now of marriage is to say this is supposed to cultivate you to come towards God, which is by the way, Daniel and a lot of other commentaries have been pointing out. What the mistake is we've mistaken the image for the reality, the image of the marriage, the image of the child, right? The depiction, the portrayal of them. Theologically, they're supposed to be oriented to God. Like that's all these are supposed to be images, signs of God, basically relationships to him, ideally. The mistake happens, and that's the thing. These are all goods, but the thing is that when those are disordered, that's another mode of like when I was meditating on justice, it's a nature of sameness or is it difference? That's precisely I'm playing with that point. Is that it's the relationship of these goods together that explains what justice is. So when something is misordered, a good has been misplaced in something higher than another, we have an error that's occurred. And I think another note of that, especially, is I think and I say this because I also say a generational shift in time, because the argument that you would never question your parents by the virtue of the goodness of existence, we take that for granted. Like that was taken for granted. The argument of the goodness of existence, about because your parents gave you birth, you were generated from them, you had a duty of justice to them, of an unlimited duty to them, because existence is unlimited. It's the same reason why we have a duty to God. It's the same. It's a formal repetitional structure, right? Because God gave us a gift of existence that's unlimited, and our parents gave us in participation of that. We have a almost unlimited, quite frankly, justice requirement to them. That no matter what they do to us, no matter how much violation, that ontological status of the fact that they're your parents was a duty that we had to honor them, no matter what. The fact that it was in the 10 Commandment that we had to honor the parent, like as an example of this. Like that's obviously, we have to point out that is absolutely not the case. Not even close. At best, this is an optional choice and then these meditations, I think some of these are perfectly fair to ask the question. I think it's also this point of what is the structure and the nature of the relationship? If it's, as Daniel said many times, we're moving beyond necessity in the sense of when it's just raw material necessity as the orientation of activity, then transactions of business, child raising, or justified, reasonable, and right, that those things are the standard. And anything extra than that is completely unreasonable. It's actually unjust. I think this is also, I say this because it's related to immigrant parents. So if you come from an immigrant dynamic, and I come from that, for example, myself, it is unreasonable to turn around and demand your parents have to conform to now your non-necessity relationship needs to you. I don't think that's reasonable because they came from a context where necessity was the demanding force. And thus the criterion of relationship was, are you being fed? Are you under a house? Are you being taken care of? And actually for them, the big operation was, are you getting education? So the idea of education as an investment to the future. And the general, it's almost it's a parody, it's a caricature of, I'm going to have my children have a better life than me because they're being educated. It's interesting how that's a mechanism. That was like that was their gift to you as an immigrant, is that gave you, they would set you up for that opportunity. And that was the act of love of gift. partly self-interest, but also kind of that kind of self-giving, giving a higher order, the kind of emotional kind of co-equality stance that I've heard from this conversation. This is a relatively modern interpretation of relationship. But I think it echoes the point of like, we're in a clearly different dynamic. One, because the ontological status of existence is no longer given as a point blank, it's good. By existence, it is good, and things that gave you existence are good by that reason, and we have duty of justice to them because of that. That's no longer the case. Second, that the marriage dynamic, the marriage entity is no longer simply an economic transaction of generating children and access to sex. Like, that's no longer the equation. It always is very important when we look at conflict, when we see tension and conflicts. This is when the reality of how things actually play out really are true, no longer the impressions. And I say this, listen, this is recorded and it's going to be on YouTube, so I want to be very clear in the statement. This can be misconstrued. This was a good judgment. This was a good ruling that this occurred. The following I said: one, that, for example, women are able to have bank accounts independent of their husbands. And for a long time, that was not the case. And second, and again, more extreme, and I want to repeat this point, I want to be very clear, this was a good judgment, that marital rape is a valid point, that a husband can be charged for marital rape. That did not exist in the past. That was, by definition, impossible, because, and the argument was made, you made a contract agreement of bodily rights. That is the contract, and you have no way to rescind that agreement while you're in the marriage. So that's my point. Like you said, I want to repeat one more time. I am not standing for the opposition of this law or change of it. But I want to point out that the old stance of marriage was destroyed when judgments like that came through, because the orientation of the marriage dynamic has changed. The family unit as the operation of economic transaction has been destroyed, and the bodily right argument of what marriage is for has been removed. There are other ones that have taken its place. I'm just pointing that out. So anyways, this is just pointing out like why we're in such a tension, like powerful discussion, is because we're seeing the radical otherness of our orientations compared to the past. That's what I'm kind of taking away from all this. And I say this too, because Bob, I wish Tom was in the room, because I like put it in the chat because he made that comment about virtues related to of others. See, that's really interesting, because see, that's absolutely correct from thinking Machian ethics. Absolutely. In fact, he says justice, which is specifically injustice, is perfect virtue because it has to be done with others and all this. Like as Shitan said, he has a different answer in Endymion ethics that correlates with the politics to the theology presentation. It's kalothea, right? It's the beautiful good. So thus this argument, and it's not just good in general. It's nobility gets translated, but the actual Greek is the word for beauty and goodness together. That's what true perfect virtue is. And then encompasses justice and the other one. So it's actually supersedes even justice in and of itself. This all relates to this. I'm kind of close. I have a lot to say because these different orientations have different consequences on what's virtue in the first place. And this is important because this idea of anxiety is because we're not sure. The part of nature, like kind of substance, like kind of, so in Aristotle, this whole idea of nature, of, how best to put this, it can be, it's not eidos, because eidos is on the form side of it. But anyway, but with that said, part of nature is the knowing of the nature, when we say the nature of things, is to say we have an understanding of its essence and its development over time. So what I mean by that is we know there's a nature to a tree because it goes from one state to the next state to the next state. There's a sense of we have an understanding of totality that's not arbitrary. It has a kind of we have a safety in that knowledge that we know its nature. By knowing its nature, we know its figure in time, its development over time, and its generation and decay and change, right? This tension about parenthood and raising is because, that's what I'm pointing at. It's like we don't have understanding of the essence of marriage, or at least the way we're talking about it, because the old models, which still exist, people do make the argument, I pay your bills, I feed you. They present that old model. But see, this is an issue of empty words. There's like words being said, but the substance behind it of what actual virtue of it, and virtue I mean by this is actuality. Like it's related to the actuality of the entity in question, of achieving its end, its purpose. That is absent. So we're kind of stuck in this great conundrum where now we're asking questions like, well, wait a minute, is it really fair that when we're a parent, we have a concern to take care of our own child, not the abstraction of 10 children down the road? Like, this is we're kind of leaning forced to ask these questions because we don't have understanding what the substance of marriage or family and relationships and parenthood is actually about. But I do think this is an opportunity because I talk a lot. I thank you for humoring me because there was a lot to be said. This is an issue of, again, why have a discussion of the beautiful versus the good? This is very important because the question of the articulation, what is the nature of the beautiful in law? What is the nature of the beautiful in relationships? That is different from the good. The good is very concrete. It can give you a very clear answer, but its nature, it will draw up in the question of politics. If you go down that route, you're getting Nicky-Macky ethics, you're getting politics. You're going down that direction, you're going to get those answers. I sit here and say the question on the other side of what would be the beautiful, the kalos in this case. I don't think that answer is clear. It's definitely theology is part of that answer. It's going to get you there, but it's not totality of it. I'm just painting out the picture of what are the consequences of it. But I think, Daniel, your notes before about responsibility and imagination, I think those are spot on. I think that's actually the real question mark about this. And I think it's really important, especially what one chooses, like when we think about responsibility as your ability, so that's capacity, your dumasis to respond, right? It's that response, your responsibility is your ability to respond by what you're using your imagination, which is images, by the way. So it's your nature of the images of what you choose to orient yourself around and take priority about. And that's the thing here is like, what is the nature of the image of relationships and parenthood and children? That's very curious. And I yield.
No, thank you, Mr. Jockin. And, a few things come to mind, and I've enjoyed this evening very much. One of the things that Belonging Again points out is that the loss of belongings, which was traditional belonging, which was due to the loss of givens, was primarily as a result of wanting to stop racism, xenophobia, fascism, and all of these bad things. And so we lost belonging because most of belonging in history has been due to dynamics that keep otherness out. And so we lost belonging, and it was a moral advancement. But the issue is that moral advancement has led to new problems that we are not ready to think. And as a result, we have a certain anxiety, just like you were saying, when you're caught between virtues. And when people have that anxiety, they're susceptible to strongmen, totalitarianism, conspiracies, political projects. And I think that is true with what you're saying on marriage, is that there was a moral advancement, but then not an idea of, okay, well, what is it for then? That leads to anxieties, that leads to different problems. The issue is, that's why Belonging Again Part 1 talks about the meaning crisis as a sign of hope. The meaning crisis is a result of ethical advancements. We actually do know how to get meaning. Right now, it's called be a fascist. It's called go back to xenophobia. It's called go back to closed-mindedness. You can get meaning right now. The issue is when we talk about the meaning crisis, it means that we're holding ourselves to a higher standard. And when we talk about belonging again, it's belonging according to a higher standard that has a moral advancement. But if you're going to keep that moral advancement, you have to be asking these substance ontological questions that we don't even necessarily have the education to think. So that's the tension. Belonging again, to recover belonging again, meaning again, while maintaining the moral advancements that cost the loss of meaning or that cost the loss of belonging is the trick. And I do think, just on that example, if marriage, for example, is about the cultivations of the conditions for the experience of beauty, well, there we go. That might be the starting of a conversation, right? If virtue has something to do with an experience of beauty, we have to have something like that. And for most of history, as you were pointing out, something like marriage was based on an external present, something everyone could see. There are children. The function of the marriage is to maintain those children. We can all see it. Okay, it's not really debatable. We know what to do. We are in an age now where you need to have something function like that external force that is no longer external, but more so lacking and invisible. And that is very difficult for people to do. Because basically, if you're going to say the basis of belonging is not going to be racism, or the basis of marriage is not going to be the contract, it's going to be a new abstract social value or a new value, well, then you have to have the kinds of people that can think that can be aware of that, and handle the anxiety of that, which requires basically, like we've talked about before, the possibility of the liminal web being the kind of infrastructure to so train people into that kind of thinking. But it perfectly points out the challenge. I think I would also say, me personally, and it goes to Michelle speaking on this awareness, it's exactly right that many parents, for history, the view of the parent was to provide an opportunity for the children, to provide for necessities and so on and so forth. And they don't necessarily read Heidegger or philosophy or do the same things that you do. If you, though, as the child, are aware that they acted ethically relative to what was given for them, then you don't hold a resentment, and you can move to the place where you can relate to them in the proper manner that we were saying earlier. But that realization of historic episodes is really, really important. Just like recognizing, for example, your dad didn't have time energy. You could say, well, he could have been a better dad, but I also am understandable, so I won't have resentment. Those realities of awareness and change are really, really important. And basically today, if there is something we're increasingly aware that merely providing necessity does not necessarily provide in these other imaginative areas that are really needed, then we're kind of in a Zach Stein between worlds of that awareness of what parents need to do. And if parents do need to do that, well, then we really do have to think the economic and social conditions in which that would be more possible, which has something to do, as Dave will talk about, with time energy, the ability to even think according to metaphysical values, the ability to even have the skills of conversation. My goodness, the skills of conversation are quite difficult. Most people have no idea how to converse with one another, except in a small talk structure, right? When you start talking about how do you talk about your feelings in a manner that is emotionally intelligent, not emotionalism? That's not self-evident. That's not, necessarily obvious. There's certain training that goes into that. So if we're going to, and if there's something about the ability to center on new abstract values that is really tied to the verbal language, the realm of the ethical, as Chitan was saying, then having those skills is going to be utterly necessary for being able to work in these new values. And those are not skills that are necessarily provided. There's more to say, but let me give it to Michael here. Michael, please.
I was thinking a sociology class that I took in college came to mind, where one day we were exploring different structures of community around the world, and they gave this one example of this village, can't remember the country in Africa, and it's probably not unique to either that country or probably the continent or probably much of the developing world, but children are basically raised by the entire village, and so there's like a village that is very cohesive, very connected. Everyone's living in close proximity, and child rearing duties are shared amongst primarily the women who are the child, who are the caretakers in that community. And I was thinking of there's someone kind of on this corner of the internet. Her name's Elizabeth Oldfield. She hosts a podcast called The Sacred. She's had people like John Vervaeke, really fascinating woman, and she lives with another couple, and I don't know if both of the couples have children, but I was just thinking about her when we were having this conversation, where we were kind of almost framing, not in such a concrete way, but I think we were grounding the difficulty of trying to provide for your children and having kind of this value hierarchy which places your children at the top, and still being able to participate in community, still being able to have a friendship circle, feel like you are participating in the betterment of the world outside the four walls of your home, kind of thing. And I just thought of that structure of living and how that affords parents more time and more energy to be able to participate in things other than the lives of their children if they have consistent support. And I think for the children, it's an extremely beneficial thing too to have aunts and uncles and maybe other friends of the parents, other mentor figures from either one or multiple generations removed, because I think there's a tendency, especially when children are young, to perceive the authority of their parents as inhibiting, as kind of like a stranglehold on their own freedom. But if an aunt or an uncle or another trusted adult comes in, they seem to be much more receptive to engaging, and I think there's a way in which those adults who don't see the child on a consistent day-to-day basis, when they come in, they're able to like relate in a different way. I think there's a little bit there's like more of a freedom there. And so I was just thinking about that of like, we kind of just take for granted the way that we have structured our society, where it's like, husband and wife live, they have their children. Odds are they're probably not very close to their extended family. They're quite divorced from both of those support systems, and they're kind of like doing it on their own almost. And I was just thinking about that of like, well, wait a minute, like, for much of human history, that wasn't how family units were structured. They were much bigger than that. And so, yeah, I was just wondering if, like a different engineering of the home environment can allow for like an expanded sense of agency for the parents as well, because I think that's a really important thing. Like, I think we were talking about kind of selflessness when it comes to parenthood, and kind of living for your children, which is I think that's such an exemplary, virtuous way to live. But if you've ever encountered the parents who are like, my children are my life, I live for my children, there's like a little bit of like like that strikes you as like kind of unhealthy. And so I think there's a really difficult, and someone mentioned a while ago about like, I think it was Andrew, about once you become a parent, you're kind of unsure about what you value. And I think that is true. I think what happens is, in a sense, it's very clear. It's like, well, it's my child, but that child is always changing, and it's like, okay, at some point they become teenagers, and I should probably give them more room. So how do I value and love them, but also feel at the same time like I'm kind of separating and detaching from them? Like, how do I square that in my mind? And it's kind of this ever-changing, like the goalposts are constantly changing, the parameters of the relationships constantly changing. The children, I know I was this way when I was a teenager. It's like I wanted a different thing from my parents every day. One day I wanted them, to be the furthest thing from me. The next day I wanted them to be like, my best friend. And it was, and for them, it must have just been like a headache of like, well, what do I do? Like, how do I actually parent this child? Make up your mind. Exactly. And so there's this real confusion, I think, that, the parents and the kids have. I know I'm kind of all over the place, but, I think I'll wrap up and throw it back to everyone.
No, I
take
think
the
that's
ball.
magnificent, and it's wonderful to have you here, Michael. And I think that speaks to the need for thinking storytelling in parenthood. Mr. Luber, the ambiguity moving through. We're gonna take this whole neck conversation and turn it into like a document and sell it as parenting advice, and people will be like, "Oh boy, that's great." Oh, so I think on that point, a few things, and then I'll bring it to a close last before the night beetles kill me. I actually went to drink my tea. I wish you could see all the beetles in there. It's actually hilarious. It's truly a cesspool. One of the things that has gotten us in massive trouble in thinking these family structures is the conflation of the nuclear family with the traditional family. The traditional family would have more of extended family in the area. And the problem is, and Ivan Illich would talk about the movement from subsistence culture to wage labor-based cultures, these tend to result in people needing to move toward urban centers, which on average, most people's extended family are not going to be near the urban center. You get the urban sprawl, and you get a movement toward the nuclear family as a sort of justification of a model to deal with a coordination problem for higher wages. And that leads to a breakdown of the traditional family in favor of the nuclear family that leads to everyone being sad. But that's an economic reality then that results. This is why economics and family structures are so kind of tied together, because if people are like, well, we got to move in order to get higher pay, but also Michelle and I talk about this a lot. We are way too often trained to think about solving our economic realities with wages. Like you say, well, if I need to get near the city for higher wages, well, why you could get a lower wage here, but be near family, which would open up time. So maybe actually you should think more dynamically. There is something to be said as another conversation on expanding personal finance beyond just wages to money. I like to talk about money, time, and health as being really related, and we don't tend to think those three as really important. Also, to the point, Ivan Illich, and I think this goes to Philip's point, if the family is, if the dad is working a lot to take care of the family, but he's right there on the property in the field, like the kids can see it, there's a way in which the father, even as they're economically putting the house in order, as the economic ideas go, there's a way in which the work the father is doing is intelligible to the children. It is part of their lived experience, and there isn't this vast abstraction. What happens now under a predominant wage society, there really is a sense that whatever the dad does to make money for the house really doesn't have anything to do with the house. It's really hard for him to explain what he does, and this creates a certain separation that leads to difficulties of relating. And that's another factor in this. Ivan Illich basically said that the house has become shadow work, and we don't really have houses anymore. We have apartments between work hours. Like our house is not really a home. It's not really a place of dwelling. It's where you sleep before going back to work. And that further contributes to this breakdown of alternative values from economics, because you simply cannot make intelligible what other people are doing because they're doing it at a distance and it's hard to explain, blah, blah, blah. So the movement from subsistence living to wage living is also a part of this factor. Now that would this conversation. Now that would have to be expanded on, but I do think it matters. I think also on the proximity question, that's very good on this, and very important, because we have to be thoughtful about it. The way that Adam Smith put it in the Theory of Moral Sentiments is he said, if I were to slice my thumb, I would care more about that wound of my thumb than if there was an earthquake in China that killed 5 million people. And he's pointing at this as a cruelty of human motivation that nevertheless is necessary to take seriously if you want to get a functioning society. Because you will never motivate people by moral abstractions, things outside their proximity, as you will their cut thumb. And that becomes a basis of the incentive models and so on and so forth. And yet, there seems to be something very problematic to not care at all about, say, children that are doing certain mining practices or under foreign dictators or et cetera, so forth. So for me, I guess a way that I think about it, whether it's right or wrong, maybe it's at least the beginning of a discussion, is the more my children want to consume things that require people in other nations to work as such to provide those products for them to consume, then my children would be participating to putting those other children in the line of fire, right? So if I could somehow, in a very small way, work to change what they want to do, how they want to use their time, what they demand, then the way they would participate in the economy would not necessarily contribute, or at least in a small way, may not contribute to the creation of the supply that leads to those problems, right? And this is where Michelle and I talk all the time about intrinsic motivation. If your children, in fact, had the capacity to be intrinsically motivated by less consumer-based activities, and were also able to change their demand to be the kinds of beings of whom could interact with others without having to pursue or consume as much in the economy, then that transformation of demand that is focused primarily on your own children would change their imaginative horizon to have them act in the world in however a small way to make the way that they use their free time less dependent on putting other children in harm's way. And so for me, the intrinsic motivation issue that we talk about all the time is a way to not ignore the proximity problem that Adam Smith is pointing out, or that Thomas Jockin is pointing out, because it is true. You simply cannot think about other children the same way you think about your child. But if you could, in fact, motivate them to be more incubated toward the true, the beautiful, and the good, if you could, in fact, motivate them to be more concerned on relations and community as a value versus consumption, then that would change their relation to things beyond our proximity in however of a small way. And if, in fact, that kind of motivation that is intrinsically motivated is what is behind or strongly related to that solo residue that actually explains 20 or 50% of our economic productivity, then if we could change one step at a time, 20 to 50% of the productivity that makes the economy what it is to not be dependent on putting other people in harm's way, then that may begin to be an example of how we can focus on what is in our proximity and yet simultaneously address what is beyond it without losing sight of what's immediately in front of us. That's one way I think about it. But it's been a pleasure speaking with you fine people this evening. Thank you so much for your time. Michael, it was a pleasure to have you here. Thomas Jock and Andrew Luber, Philip Shinn, and Michelle, the one and only. All the best. All the best.